Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Industry and Company Data at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be digging into all the things that have been happening at CES, what used to be known as the Consumer Electronics Show, the Consumer Technology Association's big event of the year. And with me to discuss it are analysts Neil Barbour and Stefan Modrich. Welcome to the podcast to you both.
Hey, Eric. Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, Eric.
So how was the show? We've heard all the headlines. We've seen a lot of stuff, but it would be great to get your perspectives about what was actually on the ground. And I'm curious, just maybe looking back a little, how much of some of the things that we've seen in the past have actually played out. And I will bring us back to previous editions of CES and point out that in 2023, the main stage was ablaze with all things metaverse. Still there? Are we still in the same level?
Yeah, so I'll take that one. I think a lot of the promises of the metaverse, or maybe I'll take a step back here, what's that, the common cadence for tech, right, is to overpromise in the near term and then maybe under-deliver in that near term, but then there'd be some long-term possibilities. Perhaps we're in a bit of a disillusionment trough on the metaverse again, but I would also state that a lot of the technologies that were available on the show floor that we tested and sort of saw in demos, maybe touched the metaverse or bordered the metaverse in a way that is a natural progression for a lot of that technology. I'm thinking specifically of the NVIDIA keynote, which highlighted Omniverse, sort of the end goal for a lot of the AI processing that's being done on the new Blackwell chips. And that is to say the digital transformation of enterprise and industrial, mimicking and testing a factory down to the last bolt, training robots in 3D spaces. So the convergence of AI and 3D data into one whole. And then on the consumer side, we saw a lot of smart glasses, emerge. And headsets and glasses have kind of been a story for the metaverse, since its inception, I guess. But what we're starting to see now are perhaps devices closer to the mass market than what we've seen before. I'm thinking specifically of eyeglass frames that weigh about 40 grams. They rest on the nose and ears, and they can deliver imagery overlaid on those lenses. A lot of it's heads up right now, so it's kind of notifications from your phone and turn-by-turn directions, but we're moving closer to the merging of the digital and the physical worlds, which we've explicitly outlined as part of the metaverse in our coverage.
So augmented reality, I wonder some of the big headliners from 2023, NFTs. My guess is we probably weren't looking at many bored apes out there. But interesting to see that, especially when we look at augmented reality, the kinds of things that we associate with digital twins, where really we may not actually say the M word, but in fact, a lot of those same core metaverse capabilities are everything that fuels that digital instantiation that is part of the digital twin. So I guess some of those things live on. It was interesting also to see that at last year, 2024, NVIDIA was there as doing a special address, I think because they were a relatively late edition. And of course, this year, Jensen Huang is front and center on the stage. And really, I think probably the featured speaker when you start thinking about it.
Yeah, definitely. We saw an emphasis on NVIDIA this year on the floor and across, the entire week. It really felt like an NVIDIA coming out party, NVIDIA showcase. And some of this new rack scale architecture that we've seen really is, of course, designed to meet this unprecedented demand for AI processing and large language models. So, of course, those are your ChatGPTs and your other LLMs of the world, and even some of the visuals like your Mid-Journeys and others that are amplifying and really stepping up the AI capability that we're seeing on the visual and image generation front. So all of that, of course, is going to take additional processing capability, and that's something that I think we're going to continue to see NVIDIA in these data centers to be a larger part of that 2025 story.
And these are things, if you look at the step up in your capacity in the DGX, I thought Jensen's discussion of just simply the size of now the GB series systems that are there, the fact that he's identifying these are systems that weigh, just simply the physical side, that weigh over a ton, a couple tons, depending upon the configuration, that they build, they test, and then disassemble just simply because they're too big to roll into a modern data center. Talking about scale, we're definitely getting to an age in which now you've got semiconductor manufacturers who are actually building rack scale systems as part of that environment. We have stepped into a new and different world where, an organization like NVIDIA is now actually building out the capacity to be able to build implementations of their devices, not just simply providing the silicon all on its own.
Yeah, that's right. And they had one of the new Blackwell racks at the show floor, and it's just massive. It's a huge footprint. And you wonder how could they spare that? Those orders have been in for a long time now, right? Everyone's just champing at the bit for these server racks now, although perhaps it was just a demo unit. I think the other turn there to consider on the show floor in particular, when there are a lot of generative AI demos or theoretical products perhaps on the show floor, leveraging large language models. Let's say you have, a smart home good that can tap into data around other smart home goods in the house. I'm thinking of a fitness tracker can tell the washing machine that you went on a very rigorous workout today, and it'll really need to, put it on the best cycle.
This is the extra grubby cycle.
Exactly. Exactly. So that's not necessarily a large workload that needs to be offloaded to the cloud. And perhaps there is some small language models that can be employed there as well. So there was definitely a push at the show to focus as equally on what can be done on device without having to go to the cloud, where you enter security issues or data sharing issues, or maybe even power consumption issues. So you really started to see both ends of the spectrum at the show this year.
Well, we see it in our end user research. There is ongoing concern about where data needs to be brought in order to do analytics. I thought it was particularly interesting, touching back on the NVIDIA announcements, that their Digits initiative to be able to create a small desktop system that's got serious computational horsepower behind it was an interesting step, particularly because they're talking about a partnership with a traditionally cell phone oriented and small electronics oriented silicon manufacturer, MediaTek, who's actually going to be producing it for them. MediaTek already does a lot with very powerful systems for cell phones. Their latest Dimensity products have got a whole bunch of add-on AI computational capability. And to now make that shift into an ARM-based system that NVIDIA is packaging its GPU technology behind starts to speak towards an environment where you've now got development capabilities in small packages that can work on localized data, which talked about a few episodes ago in terms of some of the data pipeline questions for AI. And now you've got a device that's starting to shift not only out of Windows, because it's Linux only to start, but also shifting out of the x86 realm. And now we're starting to make a lot of our big computing infrastructure that for so long has been very tech focused now start to leverage a lot of consumer technologies to pull that together. And we're getting into interesting territory when we now put that kind of horsepower behind devices. But we see that in smart TVs and a lot of other home electronics. And I'm sure you saw a lot of that on the show floor as well.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point about, moving toward ARM and away from x86 with MediaTek, other vendors are in that space too. And that addresses not only energy efficiency, which is a key concern among smart home goods, especially once you unplug them and start running around with them, but also, interoperability, which is going to be a major challenge to overcome over the next few years. That's not to say that a lot of work hasn't already been done. If you look at standards like Thread and Matter, which can, slot into a lot of different devices and have them talk to one another, that, for the smart home to work, it needs to have a lot of devices, and a lot of those devices need to work together. You need to be able to go to the store, buy a thing, have it come home and work with the stuff you already like. And having sort of those standards backed by established companies in the space, such as NVIDIA and MediaTek, is a good omen. We talked to Samsung, they really underlined that a lot of their smart home devices don't need hubs, that they kind of have hubs embedded in them and that they can talk to one another. So they're approaching that from their own standpoint. So yeah, a lot of people rowing in the same direction for interoperability and a lot of impressive demos leveraging large language models on the floor.
Well, and to your point, this is not the only thing out there. You look at Qualcomm and Snapdragon. Of course, there are a lot of manufacturers with both silicon and the device side. I thought it was interesting to see that Google is focusing on Matter as their primary focus around home automation. Again, another smart TV collaboration, MediaTek, but that also is something where Qualcomm's been out there in terms of some of their integration as well. But interesting to see that interconnection piece starting to become much more important. I think it's reflecting a lot of the consumer frustration in the complexity of making smart home really work. But I'm curious, were you seeing Matter focus on the floor? Is that we're starting to get to critical mass around it?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned technologies that debuted in years past and have morphed into different stories along the way. That Matter kind of had a rocky sort of adoption path, it felt like in the first year or two. But yeah, it did seem like anytime you saw a thread, you'd see Matter right next to it this year, that it was becoming part of a stack of 3 or 4 technologies that almost every device needed to have. And if it didn't, it was missing that crucial tick on the box there.
One other technology, looking back last year, a couple different ones. ChatGPT was going to be installed in Volkswagens. I don't think that's happened yet, but we'll see. But transparent TVs actually finally hit the retail market. Granted, at an eye-watering price point, but they're there. But it starts to speak to this transition in the smart device and media integration piece. And actually, on our previous episode, Justin Nielsen was talking about evolutions in advertising. And this is an area where it's not only shifts towards digital buying and advertising, but starting to really build up the level of customer interaction that's possible in that smart device world.
Yeah. So what I think is going on here, right, is that there are more holistic ad campaigns that vendors can put around their inventory, right? So particularly, and this has been going on for streaming operating systems for a while, is that someone like Google TV can have inventory inside of streaming video, right? And then it can also have inventory on your home screen. And it can also put, interstitial bits between those two, like guiding you to different recommendations and so forth. So the one interesting thing that I saw that really pulls a lot of this together is when Disney was talking about its ESPN flagship, which is where the convergence of ESPN Plus and as well as the existing linear networks and ESPN Bet and perhaps some of ESPN's other interactive home entertainment, thinking of video games here, all into one space. And so if you have an issue tracking a consumer across different apps, be they in the smartphone or the smart TV, suddenly you have a lot of interactivity inside of one app that you have a lot of domain over. So you get a fuller picture of that consumer and can better serve them advertising. The AI piece sort of operates on the margins of all of this, sort of sharpening the programmatic abilities of that advertising. But yeah, I think the convergence of consumers onto the smart TV really opens a lot of opportunities for advertisers in the near term.
Well, and it's not just advertising. It's actually was something Cheryl Kingstone was pointing out also on our previous episode, which is that this starts to become another retail channel, and that you've got the potential to buy what's on your smart TV environment. It's one more channel to engage. I wonder, as we start looking towards advanced levels of product placement, because we've had dynamic video product placement in a lot of content. Again, if you're control good content, of course, you've got the more subtler forms of advertisement through product placement that you can start driving through some of the content vehicles that you've got. But this is actually taking to the next level and leveraging that multi-screen connection to be able to actually purchase through whatever that particular device is that you've got. If you see the product on the screen, if you're thirsty for that beverage, click on it and you can go ahead and buy. If you like those curtains, off you go. A lot of different options in terms of really expanding that customer relationship as you were identifying.
Right. We've seen, a lot of plays in this space with, I believe it's with Roku or perhaps Vizio. You can link your wallet right in. And as that advertising comes up, you can click and just, add it to your cart. And it's an easy checkout. I was just recently seeing on Fire TV last night, some ads would come up and say, click here to find more information about the product. I think that's probably a less interesting play on it. Then there's the next screen opportunities that are coming around. Perhaps you're watching Netflix in your Apple Vision Pro, and probably you aren't because Not too many people have one of those. But if you are, you could potentially click, I do want to buy that piece of furniture, and then it says, cool, let me take a look at your living room and we'll find out where that piece of furniture goes. There's a lot of threads to pull at here. I don't know if all of them are going to be successful, but we talked to people on and off the show floor that were looking for these different vectors and opportunities to deeply engage new audiences.
Interesting. Again, it's one of those things where you can start to get both the advertising and media pieces that then start to link to the technology to complete that loop. But linking to the technology, while it wasn't something that was directly taking place at CES, one of the other big tech headlines that is starting to overshadow some of the AI capabilities that are out there is the current administration's take on restrictions that are necessary. So this is what's called the AI diffusion policy that's looking to limit it. And Stefan, you've been looking into some of the government perspectives in terms of where this all fits. And we've already got a set of embargoes or at least restrictions on devices and silicon manufacturing capability that can be driven around the globe and geographies that are limited and restricted. This really takes to a new level. It's actually starting to shift towards also including some of the software models in terms of where they can be put forward. What's your take on what the impacts are? It's still relatively early days. It's out for comment.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, Eric. And it's definitely something that I think it's maybe too soon to know, but there was, I think, some pretty cautious optimism, but caution nonetheless. There was a very large contingent of visitors at CES, and I'm sure Neil and others could speak to what extent this has been the case in previous years, but many Japanese and Korean startups and companies that had a pretty significant presence here on the floor at CES this year. And I think there is definitely a sense of caution about the ability to collaborate on some of these AI projects, and of course, wanting to beat out China in this AI arms race that effectively the US has entered itself into in this way. And so also, in some of that same context, one of the last Biden administration actions was this Nippon Steel deal, which, although not directly tech related, could have some connection depending on what the Trump administration wants to do about that. Certainly, it's not over. And there will be, litigation that will continue to affect that case. So I think it's definitely very important to monitor, and we will see kind of how these companies pivot to share information or not in the coming years and months.
Yeah, it's bringing that up. Anytime you've got governmental constraints and regulation around any large industrial sector, and I think the Nippon Steel deal, it does, to your point, have the potential to have repercussions that will ripple out in technology, but we'll have to see where that goes. In terms of the AI diffusion requirements and limitations, I thought it was interesting, though, that the open source models and open source software weren't constrained. And I wonder whether or not that doubles down on the focus on the capabilities of open source, because, of course, a lot of what's going on in AI, and certainly in a lot of AI research, is based on open source models. We've had a set of challenges in the physical supply chain in terms of fully constraining the supply of devices and semiconductors. We've seen especially recent headlines about diversion that has been successful, exporters who are able to bypass some of those export limitations. So I think there's a lot we're going to have to wrestle with in terms of figuring out how effective that can be, and realistically, what can we really constrain in that way, and what those effects are going to be. But more to see and evaluate as we go forward.
I would just add quickly that, a lot of the vendors we talk to on the floor, particularly who are making consumer-facing devices, aren't really precious about what large language model or generative AI that they're using. They tend to just gravitate toward whatever they think will be the splashiest. That could change over time. Certainly, the enterprise and industrial applications could be more sensitive to this kind of ebb and flow. I don't know if I see it having a ton of impact on the consumer-facing products at this time.
Just wanted to add that, in terms of the way that we're seeing, I think the open source conversation manifest, I've seen that some of the largers, like the OpenAIs and the Metas of the world, do seem to be in favor of more regulation than less. And it does tend to be some of the smaller startups that are more pro open source. But it does sort of beg the question whether maybe that stance will change with the new administration, and sort of where the train departs, so to speak, with the Trump administration in terms of what aspects of that AI policy will they seek to continue, and where will they diverge. And so I do expect to see a lot of private and public sector investment to continue in that space, but whether it continues to be in this open source format remains an open question.
Well, certainly a lot to keep track of, but a lot that came out of CES that I think we will be seeing, at least hopefully relatively soon. but this has been great. Thank you both for all the insights. A lot of things to chew on. So thanks for being back on the podcast. And that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Sophie Carr, Franmi Adeoshin, and Kira Smith on the marketing and events teams, and our agency partner, the 199. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we're going to be visiting another conference, the National Retail Federation, NRF. We'll be going back to a lot of payments technology, a lot of things that we've touched on, enabling technology today. We'll see how that gets rolled out when we actually hit the show floor there at NRF. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.